Mormon Sexuality on Shame, Lust, and Love. Throughout my life in the LDS Church, I was taught two important concepts about sex. First, in the For Strength of Youth manual, I learned that, quote, sexual sins are more serious than any other sins except murder. And second, that to even look at a woman lustfully was sexual sin, along with everything else having to do with sexual intimacy. These two concepts greatly affected the way I viewed sexuality, not only as a teenager, but throughout my life as an adult. But recently, as I have learned of so many of the false teachings of the LDS Church and how they have warped my understanding about myself, those around me, and God, I've wanted to revisit these teachings on sexuality and see if they're really true. So first, is what the LDS Church teaches as sexual sin really wickedness next to murder? Because if that's true, I wonder if pretty much every one of us is going to hell. For instance, a study of over 38,000 Americans across 3 decades and printed in the National Library of Medicine concluded that by age 20, 77% of respondents had had sex, 75% had had premarital sex, and by age 44, 95% of respondents had had premarital sex. So close to 95% of Americans have had premarital sex? Wow, that's a staggering statistic. If premarital sex is a sin next to murder, as the LDS Church teaches, I look around me and have to believe that pretty much all of America is going straight to hell in a handbasket. Maybe these really are the last days. However, at the same time, the FBI reports that only 1 in 20,000 people are found guilty of murder. And that's strange. If 95% of all Americans are guilty of premarital sex, and sexual sin is next to murder, but only 1 in 20,000 people are murderers, something just doesn't add up. It feels off to me. And what about the notion that looking at a woman, any woman, even if she's your own wife, with lust is a sexual sin? Doesn't that mean that pretty much every straight guy on earth with a pulse is committing adultery in his heart every single day? Seriously, what guy in the world never looks at a woman and thinks she's attractive or she's desirable? This reminds me of a funny article in Babylon Bee printed last week called Wives, 13 Subtle Signs Your Husband is in the Mood. According to the article, a couple of the signs that men are feeling lust or desire are, he's awake. Yep, he's interested. Or, he's breathing. It's a clear sign he's in the mood. And, he married you. A clear sign, especially if he's also awake and breathing. That's kind of funny, but it's also kind of true. Most guys feel desire when they look at the woman they are attracted to or are in love with. Is that really a sin next to murder? To add to the confusion and make matters worse, organized religion, and especially the LDS Church, has created doctrines and institutions that seem to shift the focus of Christ's warning to lustful men away and to make women, youth, and committed couples into the villains when it comes to sex. If we go to any young women's group in the LDS Church, we will be bombarded with the theme of immodesty. In the LDS For Strength of Youth manual, it says, prophets of God have continually counseled his children to dress modestly. And it defines immodesty as wearing any clothing that is tight, sheer, or revealing in any manner. Young women should avoid short shorts and short skirts, shirts that do not cover the stomach, and clothing that does not cover the shoulders or is low cut in the front or the back, wearing only 1 pair of earrings, and you should be neat and clean and avoid being extreme or inappropriately casual in clothing, hairstyle, and behavior. Fashions of the world will change, but the Lord's standards will not change. The men in charge of religion seek to take the spotlight off themselves and focus instead on tightly regulating what women are allowed to wear. That's their solution to lust. It speaks volumes that women are not given a choice in the matter. In this way, young women learn from an early age that their bodies are a tool of evil. They learn that showing a little too much skin makes them at least partially responsible for men's lust, sexual immorality, or even rape. They are taught that they are literally walking pornography. I was interested to do a keyword search in the Book of Mormon for the word modesty. Guess how many times it comes up? If you guess 0, you are right. Modest, modesty, and immodesty are each mentioned exactly 0 times in the Book of Mormon. The Lord never teaches this concept. That suggests to me that this issue of blaming women's clothing choices is almost certainly an invention of hypocritical men. taken to extremes, men's regulation of women's dress produces restrictions like those found in communities like Orthodox Judaism, the Amish, and especially Islam, where men control everything a woman wears from head to toe. How is that working out in preventing lust among their men? If we go to young men's groups in the LDS Church, we hear an awful lot about how masturbation, looking at immodest women, passionate kissing, or, quote, anything that arouses sexual feelings, unquote, are pretty much the worst things you can do. The youth are commanded, you should not date until you're at least 16 years old, and when you begin dating, go with one or more additional couples, and avoid going on frequent dates with the same person. Young men are consistently taught that the powerful sexual feelings they experience as they mature are inappropriate in God's eyes. They are taught to repress those natural feelings, to feel guilt for them, to confess them, and to associate them with evil. The problem with religions trying to control young people's natural tendencies in the name of God is that it has some serious negative consequences. On the one hand, those who internalize these restrictive teachings begin to associate their bodies and sexual feelings with sin. This creates so much shame and guilt around the issue of sexuality that as they mature and form families, they continue to believe that in many ways sex is still wrong. And in the LDS world, this has caused a phenomenon called the good girl syndrome, where many married women are not able to disassociate married intimacy from the evils of sex they were taught all through their youth. And so they struggle to find the joys of mutual intimacy, to communicate their desires to their partner, and to pass on a knowledge of the beauty of sex to their children. Over time, these problems create an entire culture of people who are repressed, frustrated, anxious, and confused. They're left to wonder, is this what God intended for us? On the other hand, those who are taught the restrictive rules of LDS purity culture and break them experience a whole different set of consequences. Those breaking the rules of modesty, masturbation, or even basic levels of immorality face serious punishments. Just as a side note, that word immorality, along with morality and moral, also never appear once in the Book of Mormon. The punishments for immoral behavior range from having to meet regularly to confess all the details to their bishop, to being banned from taking the sacrament in front of their families and peers, to not being able to go on a mission or being sent home in disgrace if they sin on the mission, to being denied admission to or being kicked out of a church college. I personally know people who have experienced each one of those consequences. These individuals are made to feel cultural shame and guilt, as well as the intense judgment of their families, friends, leaders, and congregations. It's no wonder we are scared to death to talk about intimacy in our wards and families. In the LDS world, the restrictions around sexuality aren't just for the young. They extend far into adulthood. For instance, before a couple can even be married in the temple, they're first told that God requires them to begin wearing garments, even though no revelation has ever been printed commanding garments. Back when garments were first introduced in the early church, they covered the entire body from the neck down to the wrist and ankle. Although the church hilariously claims fashions of the world will change, but the Lord's standards will not change, garments have thankfully changed drastically since the 1800s, but they do still cover us from shoulder to knee. And importantly, we are taught that the garments are to be worn at all times, even while sleeping with your spouse, which has led some people to believe they are even to be worn during sex. LDS adults also have many other restrictions put on their sexuality by the church. The issue of birth control comes quickly to mind. When we were preparing to marry, we were told in no uncertain terms that birth control was immoral in God's eyes, and that we were supposed to have all the children that unprotected sex sent us. Another restriction is oral sex. During my lifetime, the first presidency of the church has issued this revelation, which to this day has never been rescinded. Married persons should understand that if, in their marital relations, they are guilty of unnatural, impure, or unholy practices, they should not enter the temple unless and until they repent and discontinue any such practices. The first presidency has interpreted oral sex as constituting an unnatural, impure, or unholy practice. Wow. This ban on oral sex causes a serious issue with intimacy for many women. Research has shown that up to 70% of women do not have orgasms through simple intercourse, but are able to achieve orgasm easily by masturbation or other direct clitoral stimulation, such as oral stimulation. In a church that already teaches the evil of masturbation for everyone and prohibits oral stimulation for married women, the resulting effect is the elimination of sexual fulfillment for over half of all of its female members. I have to pause and just wrap my head around that fact. The LDS Church may not yet be on board with the religious leaders of Islam on the issue of female circumcision, where in some nations of the world up to 50% of women have their clitoris surgically cut out, effectively denying them any chance of sexual fulfillment. But if most LDS women are already currently sexually frustrated, aren't they also halfway there? I have to ask myself, what is the real goal of these male religious leaders? It's easy to guess at their motives in conveniently receiving a revelation that God doesn't want them to have to work to pleasure their wives. But what about the bigger picture? Why do they try so hard to focus the discussion about lust and immorality on women and on the youth? I think the Book of Mormon points to the reasons why leaders do this. As I really study this book, I see a major theme that runs through it. A theme of leaders seeking to usurp power and authority in the church and the community. And they do this through instituting the age-old plans of all men who have lusted for power since the beginning of time. Namely, they institute a system of secret signs and secret words and covenants and oaths. And they administer these oaths unto the people to keep them in darkness, to help such as sought power to gain power, and to murder, and to plunder, and to lie, and commit all manner of wickedness and whoredoms, and to rule and do according to their wills, that they might get gain and glory of the world, and moreover, that they might more easily commit adultery. It's amazing to me to read this in the Book of Mormon. It's such a huge clue to the motives of powerful men, not only throughout history, but also now. So, how do these methods of the powerful play out in our day? I see it happening in a couple of ways. The leaders invent super strict rules of morality and combine them with a system of binding oaths and covenants to, first, keep members constantly burdened down in guilt and willing to give the leaders money and power over them. And second, to focus the attention away from the leaders' immorality so that they themselves can more easily commit whoredoms. So first, the leaders get money and power by keeping everyone feeling guilty. Here's the process I've witnessed so many times throughout my life. Number one, begin by teaching that we are all sinning every day. Men by merely looking at women, women for never being modest enough and, gasp, wanting sexual fulfillment too, and youth for feeling natural feelings of sexuality as they age and exploring those feelings. President Kimball was a master at guilt tripping with his book, The Miracle of Forgiveness, which prescribed as required reading for so many members, promoted a hyper-scrupulosity, a feeling like you've never confessed everything, of always being stressed out that there's something you forgot to repent of that's going to get you sent to hell. Second, as soon as someone feels guilty for breaking one of the many rules or guidelines, church discipline kicks in. The offender has to meet alone with the bishop and tell him all the gory details. Perhaps the person gets a light sentence, no sacrament for a few weeks, or maybe they have to go to a formal disciplinary council where they have to repeat all the details of their sins to a leering panel of higher male leaders. Third, in both cases, the leaders then offer themselves and their authority as the only possible solution, telling the poor guilt-ridden person that unless they show contrition and the proper obedience to them and pay a full tithing into the bank accounts of the church, they will never be forgiven and will possibly lose their family in the next life. And fourth, for a normal, healthy individual, this process of falling to temptation and going through the repentance process with the leaders can happen many times throughout their youth and adulthood. What a traumatic cycle. What a damaging and humiliating way to live. And what an effective tool for creating an entire class of humiliated, subservient, tithe-paying members. Just as the Book of Mormon describes, it's the perfect plan for gaining both power and money. The second motive I see for church leaders to focus so much guilt and shame on women, the youth, and lower-ranking men is to divert the attention away from their own immorality so that they can more easily commit whoredoms. As I've finally been able to step back and look honestly at the church hierarchy and structure, I begin to see all the things I couldn't see before because I was so focused on my own guilt. Things like, number one, scout abuse. I spent much of my life involved in scouting and learned of several instances of abuse that were covered up. It was tragic but not surprising to learn that so far over 92,000 young men have come forward and told their stories of sexual abuse by leaders in the LDS-dominated scouting program. What a staggering number of heartbreaking tragedies that were enabled by LDS leaders and institutions. And the reported cases are probably just the tip of the iceberg of actual cases. Number 2, leader abuse. Again, I personally know of tragic cases of grooming, seduction, sexual exploitation, and abuse by priesthood leaders. They remind me of the tragic case of McKenna Denson, a young sister missionary who was abused and raped by the MTC president when she was a missionary. His name was Joseph Bishop, and it happened in the 1980s. She reported the abuse to over 10 LDS authorities, but instead of helping her, church leaders worked to cover it up and protect one of their own. It took her many years to finally get justice when President Bishop was finally caught on tape admitting to the abuse. I can only imagine the shame and despair of being abused by a powerful leader of the church and having the powers of hell work to crush and discredit you until you want to give up. Number 3, this brings me to the fact that the LDS Church retains an entire building next to Temple Square full of Curtin McConkie lawyers that work day and night to silence and cover up for sexual abusers within the ranks of the priesthood hierarchy. To think that for decades the church defrauded me of hundreds of thousands of dollars in tithing in order to pay their filthy legal teams in such work, it makes me sick. And number 4, what can I expect from a church founded on polygamy by Brigham Young? To read through the tragic stories of manipulation, intense pressure, threats, and abuse that coerce thousands of defenseless women into a heartless system of harems kept by oppressive LDS leaders, stories of wife-stealing and wife-swapping and arranged marriages of teenagers to elderly church leaders, I feel such sadness for all of my ancestors who were caught in that web of hell with no way of escaping. It seems the whole structure of the church is designed specifically to give leaders opportunities to mark, groom, and sexually abuse the powerless. From the overnight camps, the co-ed trips, the late-night meetings with subservient auxiliaries, the closed-door interviews with explicit sexual questionings, to the callings extended by the leaders to hand-picked women and youth that bring them into constant, close, and private contact. I see so many echoes of the former Catholic Church now in the LDS Church. It makes me realize that the great and abominable church spoken of in the Book of Mormon is not an individual church, but a pattern for all such institutions, founded on similar principles of covenants, hierarchy, secrecy, and power. What a tragic thing to see played out in our own time. And so, looking at the LDS Church and other similar institutions, I can see how flawed and dangerous they are. But what now? What actually is true about sexuality? What does Jesus want me and my loved ones to do or not to do? This whole question has confused me for a long time and caused me to really search the scriptures. I looked closely at Christ's teachings in 3 Nephi and in the Bible where he says, "Whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery already in his heart." And I read over and over the story of Alma and his son Corianton, who left the ministry to chase after prostitutes, causing Alma to say, "These things are an abomination in the sight of the Lord, yea, most abominable, above all sins, save it be the shedding of innocent blood, or denying the Holy Ghost." Then I studied all the instances in the Book of Mormon with the words adultery, whoredom, fornication, and lust in their contexts, and tried to get a big picture idea of what was going on. I knew there was something serious and true that Christ was trying to teach in 3 Nephi, but it felt different from what I'd always been taught growing up. But slowly a theory started to form in my mind of what the Book of Mormon was really trying to say. But I couldn't verbalize it until finally I saw an interview last week by an evolutionary biologist named Brett Weinstein. In the interview, Dr. Weinstein talked about human sexuality in light of our evolutionary progression, and how throughout time, women and men have approached sex differently. Women have been consistent until just recently in their approach of seeking a partner who would remain with them and help them raise and provide for their offspring, since the resource and energy costs of raising children are so high. Men, however, throughout time have had two competing sexual drives. One drive that mirrored the women's philosophy of forming a pair bond and caring for each other and their young, and another drive of attempting to spread their seed as far and wide as possible, with little care or consideration for the woman or her offspring. This explanation of the two sides to man's sexual attitudes rang true to me and coincided with what I have observed all my life, living among many different people. The more I thought about it, the more I felt it was an illustration of the natural man that is an enemy to God, and of the righteous man who keeps God's commandment to love. This concept was also poignantly illustrated by a YouTube video I recently saw of a young married couple called the Campisis. They're cute together, and they speak very honestly and sometimes irreverently about some of the struggles of relationships and marriage. In one video, their dialogue was the following. Wife: I saw this thing that says the average man sees about 5 women a day that he wants to sleep with that's not his wife. What do you think about that? Husband: I think it's a lot more than 5. Wife, alarmed: How many? Husband: Like 60. Wife: Andrew, what the heck? Husband: Well, I'm not going to do it. I love you. I'm just saying there's this natural feeling of testosterone flowing through my body where sometimes I just want to rail that girl. Wife, mouth open, aghast. Husband: But I don't do it because I'm honorable. Wife: I'm going to cry. Husband: No, cry tears of joy because I love you. I think this man speaks for the majority of straight men in describing the two conflicting natures that we are born with. It's not something we usually talk openly about because of social taboos, and so to see them address the issue so openly I think is helpful for everyone to understand and confront reality. Men's dilemma is understanding which nature we allow to control us. The husband in the video chose to love his wife and children, and they show that happiness of that decision in each of their videos. My friend Jackie shared this corroborating scripture from the Book of Mormon that shows the opposite choice. Alma says, all men that are in a state of nature, or I would say in a carnal state, are in the gall of bitterness and in the bonds of iniquity. They are without God in the world, and they have gone contrary to the nature of God. Therefore, they are in a state contrary to the nature of happiness. I believe that men who choose the natural man tendency to spread their seed to the wind without working on forming a lasting pair bond based on equality and love are without God in the world and suffer bitterness. As Alma says, they are in a state contrary to the nature of happiness. What a perfect illustration of the difference between sexual selfishness and predatory behavior versus sexual equality and love. Man who is only interested in spreading his seed as far as possible without consideration for women becomes a human predator. His goal is always to take, not to give. He takes through any means available to him: manipulation, pressure, coercion, seduction, payment, or even force. From the young man carving notches of his conquests on his bedpost, to the boss leveraging his position to pressure another secretary into his bed, to the rapist or serial abuser, they are all on the same spectrum of the sexual predator, which could help to explain the statistic that 81% of women in the United States report experiencing some form of sexual harassment and or assault in their lifetime, and 20% experience completed or attempted rape during their lifetime. That's 1 in 5 women. These statistics are so sad. I've come to believe that this predatory side of man is the side that both Jesus and Alma were warning us against. Corianton used prostitutes, used them up and spit them out like cheap gum, just like his grandfather Alma's fellow priests to King Noah did when they spent their strength with harlots. King Noah also used his power and position to coerce his subjects into giving him their daughters for his harem of wives and concubines. And the Nephites, at the end of the Book of Mormon, preyed on the captive daughters of the Lamanites like beasts, cruelly raping them before killing them and eating their flesh. Imagine an entire society where all the men are Ted Bundys. It's no wonder Christ wiped them off the face of the earth. Each of these acts were the acts of a predator. I believe they are what Jesus was talking about when he said, "Whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery already in his heart." I now understand lust to mean the desire to take, to possess, to use up, and even to hurt. Like Laban, who lusted after the gold and silver of Lehi. Nephi records, When Laban saw our property, that it was exceedingly great, he did lust after it, insomuch that he thrust us out and sent his servants to slay us, that he might obtain our property. This is only one of 3 examples of the word lust used in context in the Book of Mormon, the other 2 being Corianton's lust for prostitutes and Jesus' command not to lust. In order to understand what the word lust means, I imagine substituting a few of Nephi's words into the context of sexuality. What if it were to read, when Laban saw our daughter, and that she was exceedingly beautiful, he did lust after her, insomuch that he thrust us out and sent his servants to slay us, that he might obtain her. What a powerful illustration of what Christ must have been talking about. Lust is such an evil motive and a powerful force for harm and oppression. The history of mankind down to the present day is full of such people that use power, influence, and force to take what they want from women and children for their own pleasure. Further, in my studies, I have come to believe that sexually robbing or selfishly taking is what Jesus meant by adultery. Sure, I was taught all my life that adultery meant sleeping with somebody else when you're married, and that is a terrible and hurtful thing. But the word adultery hasn't always been that definition. In fact, it used to mean such things as sex between a husband and wife for recreational purposes, or idolatry, or perversion, or heresy. Adultery is clearly a word that has changed with time. So what did it originally mean? What did Jesus mean when he said adultery? In looking through the Book of Mormon, I find adultery most often in scriptures that are also full of violent or taking actions, such as, neither have I suffered that ye should be confined in dungeons, nor that ye should make slaves of one another, nor that ye should murder, or plunder, or steal, or commit adultery. And, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal. And, they ought not to murder, nor to plunder, nor to steal, nor to commit adultery. And, but if he murdered, he was punished to death. And if he robbed, he was also punished. And if he stole, he was also punished. And if he committed adultery, he was also punished. Yea, for all this wickedness they were punished. That is so interesting to me. In the Book of Mormon, adultery is always lumped together with the similar actions of stealing and murdering. So what does adultery really mean? Alma told his son it was the sin next to murder. To get a clue, I looked at the crime statistics for the FBI in 2022. Do you see what I see here? A sin next to murder. The 2 things the Book of Mormon always includes with adultery are murder and robbery. And in our day, they are as closely associated in frequency and severity with rape and abuse. Could rape, or any sexual act of predation like it, be what the Lord means by adultery? Even if it is done to a lawful wife? If so, then looking on a woman, no matter her marital status, even if it's your wife, with the intent in your heart to plan to violently or coercively take from her, would fit perfectly into Christ's warning of not to lust. Does that mean I think sleeping with someone else's wife isn't evil? Of course not. In fact, I think it's a kind of predatory act also. Sexual gratification with no chance of commitment. It's another form of scattering seed as widely as possible with no intent to provide love or support. And I don't think rampant premarital sex is good either, especially when it involves predatory thinking, like today's playboys trying to up their body counts. Even if they are not exactly raping their victims, they still most often do lie, manipulate, or even coerce them, which often leads to much the same result as rape. We all know the stories of friends and loved ones. So who isn't an adulterer or lustful sinner? Some of my conclusions are the girl who wears clothes she's comfortable in, even if they don't measure up to an old male leader's guidelines. A boy who tries to make sense of his sexuality without preying upon women. A man who looks on his wife with healthy and respectful desire and seeks equality in their relationship by making sure she is sexually satisfied too, even if that involves couples masturbation or oral sex. I also don't think talking about and educating healthy sexual behaviors and practices should be as taboo as we make them. Darkness and secrecy are evil, and openness and truth are light. There are so many good people in the world doing the best they can to find and give love and sexual unity, who I don't believe are offending God. Some might not even have a certificate from a religious or government institution. And so what? Why do they get to make the rules? Where does God ever require a certificate? And on the other hand, there's a whole other group of people who claim to be servants of God or servants of the public, but who are the real adulterers, sinners, and predators. What about the issue of pornography? This is such a difficult subject. Everyone has someone in their life affected by porn, both men and women. Here's a glance at some of the statistics. Pornography exists on 12% of all websites and is viewed by approximately 69% of American men and 40% of American women in any given year. The average age for the first exposure to porn is 11 years old. 68% of adult young men watch porn at least once a week. 18% of women consider themselves addicted to pornography. And 88% of scenes in porn films contain acts of physical aggression. I just want to pause and take in the sadness of these numbers. This is a national tragedy. It's a worldwide tragedy. Here are some thoughts. Number one, I think that most people are victims when they first view porn. It is such an insidious industry, carefully crafted to addict and to destroy. And the LDS Church does a terrible job by making youth the criminals, while doing nothing with their hundreds of billions of members' tithing money to fight against the porn industry. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised to learn someday that they are invested and profit from it, just as they did with Big Pharma during the pandemic. Number two, I also think that we often confuse beauty with porn. A woman who chooses to wear a tank top or shorts or even a swimsuit at the beach, if she is not consciously trying to engage in sex, she is not what we have been told is walking pornography. Women should be free to wear whatever they feel comfortable in. On those same lines, I don't believe that art or pictures focusing on the beauty of the male or female bodies are necessarily porn. I agree with what has been said elsewhere, that, quote, pornography refers to sexually explicit media that are primarily intended to sexually arouse the audience, unquote. If sexual arousal is not the primary motive, I don't think it's productive to call every attractive person or picture pornography. Number three, the statistic above that 88% of scenes in porn films contain acts of physical aggression further establishes what I have come to believe about what Christ is really saying about lust, that lust is predatory, it's selfish, it's oppressive, and it's all about taking, whether within marriage or without. The fact that porn focuses on aggression should be a huge clue to us as to what the true nature and goals of its producers are. And number four, I believe that porn can be a tool to arouse and permanently establish the sexual taker and predator within us, given enough time and permission. And that's the real danger. I watched an unusually candid and open interview with one of my favorite YouTubers the other week on the channel called Diary of a CEO. The host was interviewing a female guest, and for a few minutes they took off their careful personas, and they were vulnerable as they discussed their own experiences with sex. The guest described how she was raised in an Orthodox home, and she said she was taught from an early age, quote, sexual shame and insecurity, and that being a sexual being was not of God, and that my pleasure was wrong, unquote. That is so sad, and yet so common in our culture, especially LDS culture. The host reflected and then confessed that he had also been raised in sexual ignorance and that his earliest sexual education was from porn. He described that since that time in his relationships, he was always trying to be the porn star, which he saw as, quote, very aggressive and dominating, unquote. He lamented that almost all of his friends experienced the same education and that they had all had or were having problems in their relationships, that their partners didn't enjoy sexual intimacy with them in their aggressive state. The female guest then described that she had also learned sex from porn as a girl and that for many years afterwards faked every intimate experience she had because she thought that that was the script she was expected to perform. But it left her sad and hollow and unfulfilled. She said, quote, I didn't want this type of pornified sex. Sex was being done to me. That is how most women feel, unquote. They then discussed how a man who is educated by porn, quote, comes, takes what he wants from you, and treats you like an object, unquote. What a powerful admission. Among the wealthy, the educated, the beautiful, this is the reality today. Such a tragic state of affairs, and a tragic commentary on the state of the education we provide the next generation on sex. Because of our cultural taboos and fear of communicating openly about sex, we often allow porn to be their teachers. And is it any wonder why there are so many takers and predators in the world? Jesus' foundational commandment that, quote, "Whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets," combined with his teaching that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath already committed adultery in his heart, those two should both help us to know that watching or engaging in sexual aggression and oppression are part of the predatory state of fallen man. On the other hand, these same scriptures make me believe that sexual intimacy that is based in equality of consent, equality of strength, and equality of fulfillment, is beautiful and of God. God told the brother of Jared, "Seest thou that ye are created after mine own image? Yea, even all men were created in the beginning after mine own image." Our bodies are beautiful. They are created in the image of God with wonderful sexual attractions and powers. There can be no doubt that God intended our bodies to look and function just as they do, and that they are good. And so the sum of everything he teaches me in the Book of Mormon is that when we love in equality, we are approaching the nature of God. When we lust to take and oppress, we degenerate into the natural man. And whichever of those two natures possesses us at the last day will be the one we will be restored to at the judgment bar, either to happiness and love on the one hand, or to misery and bitterness on the other. I'm coming to believe firmly that everything is connected, meaning all righteousness is connected in the form of doing good to others, and all wickedness is connected in doing harm or hurt to others. All righteousness is based on freeing and liberating others and caring for them and bringing everyone onto a level of equality. And all wickedness is based on bringing others into subjection or bondage, in oppressing others and pushing others below ourselves. All sin and righteousness has directly to do with what we do to others. As he said in Jerusalem, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me." I don't believe we can show love to God or claim to love him by any other means than by how we treat others. Sin is always interpersonal, and righteousness is always interpersonal. That is my faith and that is my religion. My final thoughts on Mormon sexuality are these. To men, myself included, how important it is to be givers instead of takers. How essential to daily choose the good, civilized, godlike side within us and reject our predatory and lustful side. To the youth, I hope you can grow up in a society where you are loved and not shamed, where we can educate you openly and clearly about sexuality and intimacy and support you and love you unconditionally as you find your way in life. To society, I hope we can create a civilization that protects women and children from predators, especially the ones in sheep's clothing, and that we can reject the secret combinations and powerful institutions that protect each other in committing such awful crimes against the powerless. I wish we could rise up together and root out the pornography industry from among us and stop casting blame on the victims of porn. To couples, I hope we can learn to communicate, cherish, and fulfill each other in equality and unity. Love and sex are such a beautiful thing when we break free from both religious orthodoxy and selfish lust. We've been kept in sexual ignorance, darkness, and shame and captivity for far too long. The Christ of the Book of Mormon offers a better way. He says, "Shake thyself from the dust. Arise, sit down, O Jerusalem. Loose thyself from the bands of thy neck, O captive daughter of Zion." Indeed.